At 10:47 on a rainy Tuesday night, when my husband's daughter arrived at our lakeside home with her exhausted husband and two battered suitcases, she did not ask whether they could stay. She placed a handwritten schedule on the kitchen island and announced, "If you're going to have us here, you'll need to follow this. My father deserves a peaceful home and I won't let anyone take advantage of him." Before adding rules about meals, laundry, cleaning, shopping, and even when I was allowed to use the living room, as though I were a temporary employee rather than the woman her father had chosen to marry. I looked at her carefully and realized that beneath the polished clothes, expensive handbag, and icy confidence was a woman carrying years of anger. So instead of fighting her, I folded the paper, slipped it into a drawer, and calmly replied, "You can stay as long as you need, but you cannot turn kindness into obedience." Then watched her expression change when she understood that I wasn't afraid of her. My husband, George, had spent decades building a successful logistics company in Minneapolis before retiring after his first wife died, while I, Marianne, had built a quieter life as a museum archivist and volunteer literacy tutor, and our marriage had begun unexpectedly when we met during a historical exhibition, where George spent an hour arguing with me about a photograph neither of us could identify. His daughter Sophie, however, had never accepted our relationship because her mother's death, when she was 17, had left her convinced that her father had replaced their old family too easily. And when her own restaurant failed after a disastrous business partnership, she and her husband Ethan arrived at our home carrying debt, resentment, and the belief that I had somehow stolen the life that should have belonged to her. For several weeks, Sophie tested every boundary she could find, criticizing the meals I prepared, questioning every purchase, complaining that George spent more time talking with me than with her, and deliberately creating little confrontations designed to make me lose my temper. But I refused to compete with a wounded daughter for a husband's love, and instead continued my routines, leaving each morning for the museum, tutoring teenagers twice a week, and spending Saturday afternoons helping at a community food pantry. One evening, after Sophie accused me of marrying George because of his money, I finally looked directly at her and said, "If money were what I wanted, I would never have married a man who spends more time donating it than keeping it." And the silence that followed was broken only by George quietly telling his daughter, "She has never asked me for anything except honesty." The real turning point came months later when George suffered a serious fall while repairing an old sailboat at the marina, leaving him unconscious in the emergency department while Sophie and Ethan waited beside me in a fluorescent hospital corridor. And when the doctors explained that his condition was stable but that the next several hours were critical, Sophie suddenly unleashed years of anger, accusing me of controlling her father, taking her mother's place, and convincing him to abandon his own daughter. I listened until she finally shouted, "You don't understand what it feels like to lose your mother and then watch another woman become the person your father trusts." And instead of defending myself, I took her trembling hand and answered, "No, I can't know what 17-year-old Sophie felt, but I can promise you that she doesn't have to fight me anymore," which left her staring at me as if nobody had ever offered her compassion when she expected an argument. That night, Sophie finally told me the truth she had hidden beneath every insult. After her mother died, she had waited for George to stop working long enough to notice that she was falling apart. But he responded by building his company bigger, paying for everything she needed, and mistaking financial security for emotional presence. So she grew into adulthood believing that if she controlled people first, they could never abandon her unexpectedly. I told her about my own childhood, when my father disappeared after my parents divorced, and my mother taught me that some people leave no matter how desperately you try to keep them. And I explained that George and I had both learned different versions of the same lesson, that love cannot be secured through control. Before Sophie broke down against my shoulder and whispered, "I thought if I made you leave, Dad would finally have to choose me." George recovered slowly, and during those difficult weeks, something inside our household changed completely. Because Sophie stopped treating me like an intruder and started asking questions about my life, Ethan found steady work again. And George finally admitted to his daughter that he had spent years trying to compensate for his absence with money when what she had really needed was his time. Several months later, Sophie moved into her own apartment, restarted her career with a smaller business, and began visiting us every Sunday, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes cooking dinner, and once arriving with a framed photograph of George and her mother that she placed beside a photograph of the three of us before saying, "I don't need you to disappear for Mom to still matter." And I knew then that the family we were building wasn't replacing the past. It was finally making room for it. Today I still remember the night Sophie tried to hand me that ridiculous list of rules, because what looked like an attack was actually the beginning of a conversation none of us had been brave enough to have. And I learned that forgiveness does not mean pretending cruel words never happened. It means understanding the wound behind them without allowing that wound to control your future. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.